Hello everyone, this is Chris here with another edition of Philosopher's Ideas between 10 minutes and 10 hours. This time I will be venturing into political philosophy with a long essay from John Stuart Mill on liberty. John Stuart Mill was an influential moral and political philosopher and logician. Like all great philosophers, his work continues to be relevant. On Liberty, published in 1859, is his defense of civil liberty in general, not just against kings and emperors, but also against the tyranny of the majority in democracies. It is arguably one of the definitive texts of classical liberalism that has exerted an influence throughout the Western democracies up to about the end of the 20th century. Classical liberalism refers to a support for civil liberties and property rights, shared also by parties that may call themselves Republican or conservative. Here I will focus on four themes that take up most of the work and that are especially relevant to contemporary society. The argument for an individual's three freedoms: free speech, freedom of character as an experiment of living, and the freedom of action, and also group freedom. In the critical comments, I will agree with him on one of these themes and will attempt to show that his argument against the right to censor speech can also justify a preclusion of some other rights he wishes to defend. In other words, I will argue that an inconsistency in Mill's thinking exists, such that he cannot have at least some of his other freedoms if his defense of free speech is valid. But for now, let's go to Mill's perspective. Much of this short book is dedicated to defending the right to speak one's opinions freely. In his time, this meant the freedom to speak against those in power, without consequences. It is this freedom without consequences here because Mill's inquiry is asking the question of when the state or society can be said to have a right to intervene in the decisions of the individual, without assuming they would always have that right. He says in the introduction, at the start, the subject of this essay is not the so-called liberty of the will, but civil or social liberty, the nature and limits of the power which can be legitimately exercised by society over the individual. As for how much of an extreme he thinks free speech should be allowed to go, he does have an answer here on page 24. And I'm going to give his answer. He says, "Strange it is that men should admit the validity of the arguments for free discussion, but object to their being pushed to an extreme, not seeing that unless the reasons are good for an extreme case, they are not good for any case. Strange that they should imagine that they are not assuming infallibility, when they acknowledge that there should be free discussion on all subjects which can possibly be doubtful, but think that some particular principle or doctrine should be forbidden to be questioned because it is so certain. That is, because they are certain that it is certain." So I suspect this is Mill's way of arguing that freedom of speech is specifically the freedom to speak against power in a way that power will consider controversial, potentially adversarial to it, potentially wrong, mistaken, without which this freedom becomes a meaningless liberty to conform within limits set by power. Mill's reason for this has to do with how certain we can be that we are certain, which is not at all if we do not allow for a full, rigorous debate. To leave every issue open is a fallible being's only path to certainty. So, Mill will later, though, admit one limit to free expression of ideas, and it is regarding the incitement to riot. And he says on page 49, and I will, after a few minutes, stop quoting so much, but I do want to get what he says out on these questions. He says, an opinion that corn dealers are starvers of the poor, or that private property is robbery, ought to be unmolested when simply circulated through the press, but may justly incur punishment when delivered orally to an excited mob assembled before the house of a corn dealer, or when handed about among the same mob in the form of a placard. Acts of whatever kind, which, without justifiable cause, do harm to others, may be, and in the more important cases absolutely require to be, controlled by the unfavorable sentiments and, when needful, by the active interference of mankind. So this is actually in accordance with Mill's theory of one person not having a right to cause harm to others, and it will be something we discuss later. And as for any disrespectful behavior in debating that may worry some people, Mill also has an answer to that one. Ultimately, it is that the nonconformist needs to resort to facts and reasons to be convincing. And he says on page 47 about disrespectful behaviors in debating. The worst offense of this kind which can be committed by a polemic is to stigmatize those who hold the contrary opinion as bad and immoral men. To calumny of this sort, those who hold any unpopular opinion are peculiarly exposed, because they are in general few and uninfluential, and nobody but themselves feel much interest in seeing justice done to them. But this weapon is, from the nature of the case, denied to those who attack a prevailing opinion. They can neither use it with safety to themselves, nor if they could, would it do anything but recoil on their own cause. So what Mill is saying here is that those who are proposing new or unpopular ideas know they have to treat people with respect in attempting to convince. It is the other side that has a weapon available to declare that people who do not agree with them are bad or immoral men. And if fear of bad behavior justifies censorship, therefore, it is the conformist stating received opinion that we would need to silence. Mill brings forth three objections to censoring opinion. The first is that in not allowing free speech assumes our infallibility, and thus there exists no right to decide the matter for all mankind, denying others their means of judging, as well as the benefit of truth. And Mill does argue against deciding for others. He states of censored opinion on page 21, he says, the opinion which it is attempted to suppress by authority may possibly be true. Those who desire to suppress it, of course, deny its truth, but they are not infallible. They have no authority to decide the question for all mankind, and exclude every other person from the means of judging. To refuse a hearing to an opinion because they are sure that it is false is to assume that their certainty is the same thing as absolute certainty. All silencing of discussion is an assumption of infallibility. The second argument is that if the censored opinion is false, censoring it disallows a greater understanding through fearless discussion of the received true opinion, and that true opinion will then be held as a dead dogma, not a living truth. And Mills suggests that the Christianity of his time and place is becoming such. So far we have dealt with situations where the received opinion is false and when true. The other possibility is that received opinion is partly true and should share the stage with its opposite theory. Mill has in mind here that opinions favorable to both aristocracy and democracy, property and equality, liberty and discipline, and other antagonisms be discussed with equal freedom, talent, and energy, that both obtain their fair due. This also fits in with Mill's common theme throughout his discussion about expression of opinion, that if we want to be certain of our opinions and believe them in a lively way, it is by means of lively debate that allows for whatever merits of the contrary opinion to be heard. Then, even when we were right all along, we are now more cognizant of the grounds of our true opinion. Now, if one accepts the freedom to have and communicate one's own opinions, it implies the question of whether one should also be allowed to, in some sense, be the individual that one is, where the risk, if any, is only to oneself. This seems to make sense, and Mill will argue that this further freedom is so implied. If we are not infallible, and if diversity of opinion is good, he says, so it is that there should be different experiments of living, that free scope should be given to varieties of character, short of injury to others. For Mill, this assertion of individuality is an essential ingredient of happiness and human progress, where such is missing when one does something merely because it is custom. Mill argues for this on several fronts: the importance of the genius, a comparison of Chinese and European progress due to Chinese culture being more attuned to universal conformity, and another objection against social custom not always fitting every individual. But his human progress appeal has a particular highlight in the importance of the genius. He says on page 56, persons of genius, it is true, are, and are always likely to be, a small minority. But in order to have them, it is necessary to preserve the soil in which they grow. Genius can only breathe freely in an atmosphere of freedom. Persons of genius are ex vi termini, on the strength of its terms by definition. Persons of genius are ex vi termini, more individual than any other people, less capable, consequently, of fitting themselves, without hurtful compression, into any of the small number of molds which society provides in order to save its members the trouble of forming their own character. That custom, followed as custom, is not conducive to the mature development of the human being is one of three objections Mill has to following custom. The Chinese comparison to European progress is one of greater industrial and scientific progress in the geopolitical area, where culture is less conformity-oriented. This is probably his weakest argument, as well as the one he might leave out if written today, because it is a declaration of a correlation of a small number. Today it may be argued the wealth of contemporary Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong, also having cultures that highly value the following of the rules I think, invalidate this particular argument. For his third argument, ultimately the customs of other people are what experience has taught them, and that their experiences may be too narrow or interpreted wrongly. This objection is that, even if interpreted right, these experiences may not be suitable to an individual for his mature development, being for customary characters in customary circumstances. An individual may judge that it is more suited to those of a different character than himself, or in different circumstances than himself. And so Mill says about it on page 51, he says, "Nobody denies that people should be taught and trained in youth, as to know and benefit by the ascertained results of human experience. But it is the privilege and proper condition of a human being, arrived at the maturity of his faculties, to use and interpret experience in his own way. It is for him to find out what part of recorded experience is properly applicable to his own circumstances and character." On individual actions that may have an effect on others, however indirectly, Mill takes a position that one should be fully free to do whatever one wants, so long as it affects the interests of no person other than himself. Here Mill starts to develop what may be called his version of a harm principle of liberalism, that one person should be free to do whatever does not harm another. This is consistent with and follows his arguments for individuality, that new or uncommon behavior is also effectively an experiment in living from which we can all learn. A variety of these experiments can benefit society, and this is why Mill also argues for tolerance for the harmless eccentric as well as for the genius. He does, however, advocate for social disapproval and refusal to keep company or deal with those morally abhorrent to us. He draws a distinction between legal and social sanctions, where he says the acts of an individual may be hurtful to others or wanting in due considerations for their welfare, without going to the length of violating any of their constituted rights. The offender, he says, may then be justly punished by opinion, though not by law. We can then bring social sanctions upon this person without the force of the state being brought in to force conformity with social norms. To establish this, Mill argues that it is not as if society at large did not already, through the raising of children as well as social norms, have a means to tell people to properly take care of themselves. It does not need the state to step in on a pretense of a failure of the individual to maximize his capacity to benefit a society. He will also suggest that if a society raises its children ineffectively, then, he says, society has itself to blame for the consequences. Mill then seeks to defend against objections his contention that the state should only step in when he says a person's conduct affects prejudicially the interests of others. Through doing so, he gives examples of some actions he thinks justify only opinion's sanction. One objection from considering vices, such as gambling and drunkenness, is that it may be argued that after time and experience a moral truth has been established, and we need to prevent one generation after another from falling over the same precipice, or over the same cliff, falling into the same trap. Mill admits this to be at least a mixed bag, where sometimes a vice has negative effects on others. A man who is indebted may be punished for negatively affecting his family, but not for the extravagance. A soldier or policeman should be punished for being drunk on duty, but no one punished just for being drunk. So he talks about an inconvenience to society on page 68. Where he says, with regard to the merely contingent, or as it may be called, constructive injury which a person causes to society, by conduct which neither violates any specific duty to the public, nor occasions perceptible hurt to any assignable individual except himself, the inconvenience is one which society can afford to bear, for the sake of the greater good of human freedom. And so we see Mill's opinion about vices will be that we should still disapprove if negatively inconvenienced by them, but he still will not take the position that society needs to have the state intervene, even if generation after generation has its members who drink and gamble. In doing so, Mill sees himself as opposing communities, improperly investing a public preference with the character of moral law, and then seeking to enforce that preference. One may now ask further about a situation where it is not a few individuals, but an organized group, who do something that would be society-altering if they became the prominent group. Mill considers a possibility that a community of polygamists, such as Mormons, may weaken civilization itself. His answer to this involves a proposal from someone of his time for a civilized aid to invade the separated community of Mormons and to enforce monogamy upon them. Mill argues that as long as they are in a remote area, commit no aggression against other communities, and allow free departure of its dissidents, he sees no reason to support a supposed right of one community to force another to be civilized. Mill is not noticing that now, when dealing with Mormons, the social sanction that he states to be permissible can be seen as useless, because Mormons do not accept the value system that would bestow upon them rogue status. Mill even says, let them send missionaries, if they please, to preach against it. That cannot be expected to instill guilt in the Mormons, as it may in drunks and gamblers who accept the values on the basis of which we condemn them. I suggest that Mill is just wrong about such a community committing no aggression, and I refuse to classify their practice of exile of surplus men as free departure of its dissidents. Mill is not understanding mathematics or not believing that reality must conform to its laws. Mormons will have a tendency to have a 50-50 split between male and female live births, just like us, and their polygamy creates surplus males that are sent into the broader community upon maturity. This then creates a gender imbalance in the community that favors monogamy and is effectively conscripted into shielding the Mormons from the consequences of their policies. If you don't see this, imagine 24 new births, 12 male and 12 female. Boy 1 marries girls 1, 2, 3. Boy 2 marries girls 4, 5, 6. Boy 3 marries girls 7, 8, 9. Boy 4 marries girls 10, 11, 12. This leaves 8 boys with no girls to marry who leave the community. If they settle in a community where there are 100 people of their generation, they create 58 boys for 50 girls. So just when will Mill state that an act is injurious, or that an encroachment on rights, infliction or loss of damage, duplicity in dealing or use of unfair advantage has occurred. In this fully developed version of Mill's harm principle, I would argue at least 3 of the criteria are engaged. Accordingly, I don't think Mill's position should be that the society that cannot protect itself through moral persuasion alone does not deserve to survive. Yet that seems to be his position regarding the possibility that barbarism left unchecked by state power may take over. And here's what he says on page 76 when he talks about it. He says, if civilization has got the better of barbarism, when barbarism had the world to itself, it is too much to profess to be afraid lest barbarism, after having been fairly got under, should revive and conquer civilization. A civilization that has thus succumbed to its vanquished enemy must first have become so degenerate that neither its appointed priests and teachers, nor anybody else, has the capacity or will take the trouble to stand up for it. If this be so, the sooner such a civilization receives notice to quit, the better. Before I end my exposition on Mill's perspective, I will mention that there is something often called his 2 maxims about the individual and society relationship that he says form the entire doctrine of the essay. It is actually covered by the foregoing here, and by the foregoing in Mill's essay. There are people who like to talk about it as something separate, though. I see it more as a good summary and a good classroom quote, but not really something additional. But still, if you read this in a class, you may have a professor who may expect you to know it on a test and potentially refuse to give your paper an A if it does not mention it. What it is the second paragraph of chapter 5. Easy enough to just gloss over and miss. And it states when an individual is not accountable to society for his actions and when he is. And you could probably guess them. The first maxim is that an individual is not accountable to society when his actions concern the interests of no person but himself. And the second maxim is that the individual is accountable to society and subject to moral or legal punishment when his actions are prejudicial to the interests of others. In its progression, on liberty goes from considering what someone may say to what a group may do. At the same time, in gradation from what may have no effect on others to something that can be society altering. In its first instance, that of freedom to speak, Mill refuses to claim a right of any person to decide for others and substitute the judgment of any individual with that of another. Yet at the end, he is claiming the effective right of a group to impose its preferences on the remainder, especially if it grows and gains an overwhelming influence or hegemony by fair means or foul. He is insisting that only moral sanction that the group of Mormons, in his example, would not accept from Christians as valid should be used to attempt to stop that hegemony from forming so that some civil conflict would not be necessary. When he talks about a society that can afford to bear an inconvenience, he is saying you can bear it. Who is Mill to decide for future generations or another community that they must face this if he has no right to decide for the Mormon that he will think and act consistent with the Christian ban on polygamy? A similar situation can occur without the Mormons if we imagine that the drunks and the gamblers are also polygamists or something else we don't like, who in some sense form an informal group that over time gains a kind of hegemony or influence, if only by young people regarding them as some kind of vanguard to which they then conform, that they're cool. In this, the situation of today, Mill does advocate use of moral sanction and the freedom to speak it, marking him as technically an enemy rather than a champion of today's warriors against intolerance. Perhaps today we should not expect that Mill, in his time, should have anticipated a tendency to resist and even bring state force against this moral sanction, as intolerance, hate, some kind of phobia, while the power of the church declines. It may be that the dominance of Christianity that opposed all freedoms may have lulled Mill into a false presupposition that freedom to speak and freedom to act harmonize together in nature, that I do not expect him to foresee the contemporary world. It is easier today to see how those given freedom to act may seek to prevent the freedom to speak in order to protect their actions from criticism, and also silence the value system that declares them to not be virtuous. One stated presupposition in the book was that the greater good of human freedom can sometimes outweigh the inconvenience to society. At times, Mill seems to talk about society and even civilization as if it were something that could be destroyed without an effect on anyone. But society has members in it, and talk about an experiment in living could also involve talk about subjects or guinea pigs who did not choose to be, however, indirectly affected. Without the guinea pigs explicitly in the equation, I think the greater good calculation seems dogmatic. Rather than talk about how a society that has become so degenerate that it gets defeated by barbarism being better let to die, we could talk instead about not degenerating it in the first place for future generations. Once again, Mill started with the idea that he had no right to choose for others, and I have argued, progressed to a freedom to act in a way that chooses for others. I would propose another consistency of continuing to argue along the prohibition path, the prohibition on deciding for others, no matter how indirectly. The idea would be that the more peaceful, prosperous, more advanced by measurable degrees and already free for speech a civilization is, the less the state should allow anyone to experiment with it. Freedom of speech with this idea I don't think is anything new. I think it is consistent with Immanuel Kant's What is Enlightenment? On liberty can be argued from all sides to have a weakness in being vague or leaving unanswered questions on many issues. But despite its flaws, the book is well written in general and a good read to provoke thought in our age of censorship and sexual freedom. However, I think it needs to be read as something that could have been written as continuing on this path rather than on that path. And that closes it out. If you like my videos, please hit the like and subscribe and watch my other videos on my channel. Thanks for watching.